What is up, everybody? It is Alex from Heavy New York, calling from the altar again, and this time we are here with death metal musician slash English teacher. We are here with Matt Knox of the Almighty Horrendous. Thank you for being here today, man. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
Yeah, I'm wondering, is there like some sort of convention or secret club of English teachers slash metal musicians? I mean, Keith Buckley from Every Time I Die, Sting. I think there was a couple of other musicians who were English teachers.
I've met many on the road, actually, which is funny. And I don't know. I think just something about literature, something about like the mythology of metal, maybe that intersect.
Yeah. Do you teach?
I think it's there for sure.
Do you teach Greek mythology?
I do not actually. I haven't, and I did. My God, I got to think because I'm at my third school now, so I've been teaching for like this will be my 10th year coming up, which is kind of wild to think about actually. Yeah. But I want to say my first school, we had like a little Greek mythology text that we used for like the world literature class, but that's it. Since then, like, no, not at all, awesome. Which is interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know how I've managed to like skip it somehow. I'm like, it's not in the curriculum I've been in, but
yeah, I mean, every year, every teacher had like a different pronunciation of how to butcher like the different gods and names. So that you got to avoid that. But when you said you taught 11th grade, I read Lord of the Flies in 11th grade, some war stories, and we read Macbeth, if you had to teach that.
Nice. Yeah. Classic. Yeah, they still do. I think my school does Macbeth. Some of the senior classes do that, actually.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
Did you do like the things they carried or something? Was that
we did the things.
Stuff?
We did the things they carried. Yep, the Vietnam War stories.
Yeah, there you go.
So
classic school text for some reason, especially when like. So how old are you?
I'm gonna be 30 in a month.
Okay, so I'm 33, and I feel like for whatever reason, when we were like, I don't know, around high school age, like that book was really popular. I don't know if they still teach it as much, but
yeah, we had to read Night by Elie Wiesel and the three Shakespeare books. We also read The Crucible. The Crucible was my favorite, and but we also read Romeo and Juliet first year, Othello, and then Macbeth.
Yeah, so, nice.
Yep.
A lot of that is still like pretty firmly in the canon right now, honestly.
That's awesome. Yeah, those are fantastic books. I bet the death metal lovers are super stoked for this part of the interview. But it's so awesome to have you here, man. But Ontological Mysterium is a fantastic disc, if I did pronounce that right.
You did, yeah.
and if you are watching this morning, happy record release day. But it's with the first three singles that we heard so far, do you feel that that's maybe a good representation of what the entirety of Ontological Mysterium is going to sound like, or is that just the tip of the iceberg?
Honestly, very much just the tip of the iceberg, which we're really proud about, actually. I think in more than other records we put out, I mean, I think we always kind of do this thing where all the songs in our records are pretty unique and like stand on their own. But this one in particular, I just think the songs have so much of their own personality and their own spirit and character in a way that like our other records, we always had a bit of that, but for whatever reason this time around, I say for whatever reason, it was very intentional this time around that each track is kind of its own journey and its own theme. And a lot of that actually came up with the writing process too. Like, I think coming off of Idol, which was this like huge piece where every single track was this sprawling, like almost labyrinth structure that kind of contains like the whole album. It was almost like each song was like this microcosm of the whole record that did everything, you know? And I think writing this record and sitting down to like think about this record, we stepped away from that a little bit, and we're thinking about more like, how do we get things a little more concise? How do we ease off on trying to like jam everything into one space, you know? And it led to this really interesting process of like one really interesting riff that had its own tone and like own unique flavor that we just let dictate like an entire song. Like, okay, where is this going? Where is this dragging us? And we were kind of following the arrow in a way, like following the path of that one singular idea.
Yeah, because it was a while since we've gotten a Horrendous album, last one coming out in 2018. Did you was the vision in a way to kind of like pick up where you left off after Idol, or was it meant to almost kind of like be a new beginning. For one thing, this is the longest Horrendous album title, so I was wondering if that was intentional or not.
It was in a way, which I think the journey of the record, and it was a long time, this 5-year wait. And I think that the journey of the record did very much begin kind of in the footsteps to Vital, and like going exactly in that same, I keep saying direction, but with that same momentum of like, everything needs to be bigger, everything needs to be more challenging. We wanted to be more challenged, and I think there was this moment right when the pandemic was happening, really, where we just recognized it wasn't going the way that we wanted it to. Like, there was a time long ago when the record actually was like 4 long songs. It was like 4 10-minute songs.
Like Blood Incantation.
Yeah, something like that, or like some old, like, I'm wearing a Yes shirt. It's like some old progressive rock band, where it's like it's a couple of 10-minute tracks, and that's the record. And there just came a point in time where none of us really felt that great about what it was. And the title track of the record, interestingly enough, was part of like an 11 or 12-minute piece. And then we're like, well, wait a second. Like, I don't even remember when this was, but there's this one like miraculous day sitting around writing songs and like listening back, where one of us just like, what if we just cut out these 5 or 6 minutes and went straight from like the beginning of the song to this middle point, and that was it, and then it ended. And I think that was a big moment that kind of shook us out of the, I don't know, philosophical like bent that we were on with how to write the record. And it was this moment of clarity. It's like, wait a second, like, we can do everything that we've been doing without adhering to this idea of like longer, I don't know, conventionally bigger structures. And like, what if we shortened things? What if we made things more concise? And it wasn't like the progressive undertones aren't in the difficulty of each track and the length of each track, but they're in like the breadth and the space that things cover. And that's kind of exactly where we ended up, where we have a lot of songs on this new record that are like 3.5 minutes. But the amalgamation and like the connection of the whole record together covers so much ground as a whole. So
yeah, well, every title I would say is like very different from each other. Like The Chills, that gives me that, that sort of chilling feeling. We all know what The Chills are. Assidious is actually, or if I pronounce that right,
I've heard like 15 different pronunciations of it.
Exodus.
So I don't even know.
I do know it was the name of the band Infected Rain's last album too. So
was it? Damn.
Yeah. So, but that's a word that many people wonder what that means and how to say it, probably. And then Anareta, which also is kind of like its own thought-provoking, and then Idol is, the death metal American Idol. So like, but I'm kidding. But like, it seems like the titles have like a lot of variation in itself. Is that part of maybe making each album its own sort of concept or having its own individual meaning?
Yeah, for sure. And I think after the Chills is very much like an homage to kind of older classic like death metal album titles, and we liked the simplicity of it. And then which I personally think was like another huge kind of transformative moment in the band's career was going from a Chills to Ectasis of just sound and like general approach, and which was of course intentional at the time. We were like, all right, we did kind of the old school death metal sounding record that's very much an homage and like a tribute to what was before. Like, how do we change this? What do we do? And I think the title selection there was of course like directly related to that change, like the shedding of like skin, the shedding of our former self and what we were doing. And I think Anareta came around, actually, funny enough, English teacher person came from a book I was reading. And it just sounded really cool. I liked that it wasn't like a common word or anything like that. And also just kind of fit the themes of what we were doing. And I think stylistically, it felt kind of similar to Ectasis. It's like this word that is a little bit of a standout. It's also short and concise. And at that time we were like, I feel like there were a lot of bands with these really long titles and like pretentious sounding titles. So at the time we were like, fuck it, we're gonna do like one word thing. And then that led us to Idol, where it's like, all right, we're gonna dispense with the difficult words and just do something simple, in a way maybe to kind of be a foil to the fact that that record was like certainly our most complex up to that point. And I think that was part of like the impulse to do that. It's like, all right, well, we have this like monster, technical, ridiculous record, and we're going to pull back a little bit on the title in that sense. And then, of course, now we're doing a 180 and going in the opposite direction. We're like, hey, we've never really had an album title that's more than a word. Fuck it. And this feels very much like a new direction for us and another evolution, and a new step. And it just felt right to do this. And honestly, when it comes to the title, like the title just came from lyrics that Damien had written. So the title didn't like predate the album, it wasn't like, this is going to be the album title, like when Damien wrote those lyrics and brought them to the band for the title track, it just kind of became like, we got to use this. It's too crazy. It's too great. Yeah. It's like an iconic phrase, just something so absurd. It's iconic. Yeah. So,
when it comes to the lyrical aspect of it, has a lyrical idea or a lyrical meaning helped dictate the direction of the music in a way, or have you always preferred to have music before lyrics came in?
For us, I mean, for me in particular, but I'd say for us as a whole as a band, music is always first, for sure. And I think in my own writing process anyway, like a lot of the times the music and I think the world that the music creates often dictates like what the song is about for me. And I kind of imagine like where is the song taking me? What are the emotions here? What is the story it's telling? And it always comes from that seed and that like imagination that I think is sparked through that. And honestly, when it comes to the record as a whole, like we rarely sit down and have a larger discussion as a whole of like, okay, guys, this is what the record's going to be about. Everyone go and write their song, It's left much more up to kind of spontaneous inspiration, I think, and spontaneous feeling. And even in terms of the song selection, it's like everybody is kind of called to write whatever song feels the most right for them. It's like, oh, I want to do that one very specifically. I want to do these two. And inevitably, we always end up in this place when everything is done where like the thematic threads are there, even though we didn't discuss it and didn't like come up with this really strong controlling idea. And I think that speaks a lot to just the creative process of this band in general. There's just so much is left to, I don't know, magical creative forces that we kind of just obey and follow. And without fail, every time it all comes together in this really unbelievable way. That we're able to trace all the pathways and all the connections like after making the thing. So there's really wild synchronicities that just always tend to happen. And part of it, of course, is just because we're close friends. And I think that closeness like bleeds into what it is that we're thinking about and dealing with and reading and like considering. And all of those things combined naturally like exude this influence over the whole project, I think. But it is kind of wild and like semi-terrifying that there is never this moment of agreement. It's almost just like, I don't know, we're psychologically in sync or something. Yeah. Just about what we're thinking and what we're approaching.
But if you mentioned a lot of it comes from a spontaneous feeling and a spontaneous moment. And which I think is really cool, but if you like work on something for a long period of time in a way, does that make it harder to sort of maintain that initial spark or that initial spontaneity?
I think it does sometimes, but I would say because we're never really set on a controlling idea, every time that we get together to play or to create is kind of a spontaneous moment. I mean, it's not spontaneous in the sense of like we have to plan to get together, but people bring ideas, but a lot of it largely is kind of allowing things to turn out as they do. And I think there's a big difference creatively between like, I have my eyes set on this final product and I'm going to make that final product happen, and in a way like force it to happen, versus allowing the thing to naturally become itself. And it's a bit misleading, I guess, because of course we have a final product in the sense of like, we are going to make a record at the end of this, right? Yeah. But I think there is, just from like playing with other people and like knowing other bands, I think there's this element to us of relinquishing control, I think, of the process in a way that not everybody always does. And that is in some ways, I think, largely why we change as much as we do, and why there is such an evolution, because there's always a commitment to evolution and a commitment to challenging ourselves, but there's never, ever kind of a restriction or a border put around, or even an outline, I would say, put around what it is that we're going to do. And I think that's the key. It's like, there's no limit, there's no boundary. Like, what happens, happens, and then we shape it into something that makes sense.
But when you form together as a band, because I feel like you, Jamie, Damien, and Alex all have individual talents that really help play a role in the sound of Horrendous. But you know, like when you get together, spontaneously or not, when you get together, you know, you all had different days, you all have different experiences, you all have different emotions that are going through you, or different things on your mind. So is it fair to say that maybe all of you being in your different worlds is sort of like what helps add contrast into the sound of Horrendous?
Yeah, for sure. Even just like, because of where we all live, like we don't always get together regularly. So it might be a month, it might be longer than that when we finally do get together and like share the same space and play. And I do think that those like individual journeys and changes do have the huge influence on that, because it's like, I just spent a month listening to, I don't know, 1950s like fucking doo-wop or something. I spent a month listening to this weird jazz fusion from the 70s. And whatever it is that's kind of occupying us in that moment, I think always does find a way into those writing sessions. And it's not even intentional. It's not like I'm going to bring like this weird classical symphony structure to the song because I was listening to Bach or something. I don't know. It's like it like bleeds into our lives, I think, and how we live them. And as we are continuously like meet and we're all growing and changing, it's like the music seemingly reflects that. And it just works its way in, I think.
And you mentioned evolution too, and how that always happens as a band, but do you believe evolution is something that you have control over? Do you have control over your own evolution by engaging in change, which brings discomfort, which leads to growth? Or does evolution just have to come naturally?
I think that's a good question. I would say in a way, I think it does come naturally, but the thing that one does control, well, here's the pitfall, I think. I think the mistake to make is to try to force the direction of that change. It's like, I'm going to control this change and go into this way. I think the control that one has over evolution of whether it's self or like art is your willingness to accept where it's going and the willingness to step into where it's going. And it's kind of like, either are you going to resist the directions that these things are pointing you in, or are you going to accept them? By accepting them, I think there's an expansiveness and a freedom that's there. It's like, oh, this is kind of where we're going. Instead of trying to go left or right on where this thing is headed, like, why not step into it and expand into it, opposed to being afraid of it or something? I don't know.
What if that change is leading to something that you don't particularly like? Isn't it good to have control over your own artistic destiny in a way? Like you mentioned that you had those 4 very long songs, but you clearly didn't want that to be the follow-up or the answer to Idol, so you reworked it a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure. And I think maybe the key there is like recognizing what those moments are, because I think I would argue that having those 10-minute songs was actually like forcing things in a way. It was like, how do I jam all of these things into all these ideas and all of these like different sounds and I don't know, speeds and rhythms and like tones. How do I jam them all into one song that makes sense, you know? And to me, that did feel a lot more forced than what we ended up doing, as opposed to just kind of like, here's a riff, it sounds cool, and what if we just kept building off of this one idea instead of trying to like make it twist and turn into all these directions? And I think that naturally brought us to something that just sounds a little more organic.
Depending on the lyrical context of an album and depending on what it's about, whether it be more personal or take inspiration from literature or an external source, does it resonate with you in a different way when performing it, or does it maybe feel like you channel a different energy, or is it even a different lyrical process altogether?
You mean in the sense like, say I take like our old song Ozymandias or something, like does the poem, does the energy of that thing come to bear like on performing it, and like is that something that I feel like,
yeah. Does it have a different feeling depending on basically what the lyrical meaning is
for any song in general?
Yeah.
You mean?
Yeah,
I think so, for sure. A lot of the lyrics that I write, particularly, I think since I am an English teacher, I think they do. Number one, there's like a lot of references and like a lot of snatching power, perhaps from things that I love and things that mean something to me.
Your lyrics will always make sense.
But I also think I just kind of have this natural drive towards like more narrative structure when it comes to lyrics. A lot of the things that I write, particularly, are like story form almost, and I do think there's this element of when one is writing in this way, there's this element of the lyrics almost like propelling the music forward as well. And it's not just the music propelling the lyrics forward and like the concept forward. And I do think songs that are particularly like narrative in style, like almost push back on the music in the same way that music normally pushes back on the lyrics. In addition to that, which I find really interesting. Also, I think if something's really personally resonant, like if a song is about a time in my life that was difficult, or like a particularly difficult emotion, like I think oftentimes live, like one does feel those again every time. And it's of course like a lesser degree depending on like your state of like emotional vulnerability maybe on a given day. But I do think that there is this element of reliving those things for sure. Yeah. And I think that does bring a lot of power to the music.
Being both a guitarist and a vocalist, do you feel like both the usages of your voice and the usages of your instrument, do you feel like that they both express the same thing, they express the same emotion or same energy, or does one instrument express a side of you that another necessarily can't?
Another great question. I would say it depends on the music, because I think sometimes my guitar is certainly used as a tool for expressing very particularly like vulnerable emotions, I think, and like beauty and sadness and joy. And I think the interesting thing to me is that like singing, not the style of vocals in Horrendous, but like singing normally, I think communicates all those things as well. Whereas I do think in an interesting way, it's almost like inverted in a band like Horrendous, where like the guitar is kind of doing more of the like emotional work, and that's bringing the joy and the sadness and like the beauty perhaps. Whereas I think the voice is primarily like aggression, maybe rage, maybe. And if not necessarily rage, because I don't think the music that we make is necessarily directed at anything in particular, so much as it is like a cathartic release of something. And I do think that the vocals for this band particularly are that. It's kind of this like shout against all of the all that is that fucking brings you down, you know? And I think that's what the vocals do, whereas the guitar in our band in particular, I think communicates all of the other emotions.
Mhm. And I have two more questions for you, but when it comes to the inspiration, it's kind of like a similar question I had on the evolution question. But like, do you believe inspiration is something that can be sought out? Can you really go out and look for that inspiration or that creative energy, or is that just something that has to strike you spontaneously, as you mentioned before?
I do think a lot of it is spontaneous. However, I think there are ways where one can very much like prime themselves for receiving that inspiration. And for me, a lot of it is simple stuff, just like reading. If I'm reading a book that I love, I mean, instantly, I think it just stimulates a part of you that isn't always accessible day to day. It's like if I'm just walking around, like doing my daily tasks and shit and going to work, no, I don't think inspiration always just arrives. It is very often, I mean, sometimes it does, of course, with like different relationships with people or conversations you have, but or I don't know, seeing like a wonderful sunset or something. But I do think things I read, things I watch, honestly, just music listening in general is so much for me. Not just like I'm going to sit down and enjoy this, but I do think is almost homework for me sometimes, especially if I'm listening to something that's challenging me in some way. And to me, that's kind of how one feeds the thing, or feeds raw materials into the source that then gives inspiration, I think, because it gets you thinking, it gets you feeling, it gets you into a space that your brain isn't always sitting in, and you just yourself aren't always sitting in. Yeah. So I guess the short answer there would be that I don't think you can force inspiration. I think you can sit down and meditate or something and try to make yourself write something. But I do think that you can create conditions that welcome inspiration more than others.
A tattoo artist I know once told me that if she only tattooed every time she was inspired, she wouldn't pay her rent. So like you can't sit around and wait for inspiration either, but you know you don't want to force anything, but you gotta like if you're a guitar player, you can't just sit around and wait for the energy to come. Sometimes you have to pick up your guitar even if you don't want it and play a little bit and create something by accident, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think those are sometimes the best times to do it, actually, is when finding a way to get around the resistance, because I think there always is a resistance to getting into that space, which is interesting. But I think there's this moment, especially there are times where I sit down and like, I have time and I'm going to try to write something, you know? And very often those sessions are horrible, and you sit down and I think the very act of trying to sit down and do it sometimes ruins the whole process in some ways. Yeah. But I also think sitting down and trying to force yourself to do it and then finding a workaround to get you out of that mindset can sometimes help, where it's like, I have to sit down in order for this to arrive, but there's also some secondary thing that I have to do that is going to break down the wall that is kind of standing in my way of becoming inspired in this moment. What is that? And I think for me, a lot of that has to do with routines and patterns, and like patterns of being. And I do think sometimes when I sit down with the instrument, like my instinct is just to like play the same patterns and do the same shit that I always do, because it doesn't require much thought. And I think being able to get to a place where like you become conscious of the fact that that's what you're doing. It's like, oh shit, I'm doing the same thing that I always do. Or if I'm writing a song, it's like the parts that are coming to my mind are like the ways that these are the exact same ways that I would solve this problem before. And how do I get out of just like retracing those steps? And I think that's sometimes where it can come. It's like, oh, maybe it's just presence. Maybe it's just that I need to be present in what I'm doing and realizing that I'm kind of functioning on autopilot here in some ways. And finding novel ways to get out of that.
Yeah. Routine, well, I think with being in a band, routine is almost going to be part of you. Like with a band, obviously anything can happen, and a lot of crazy spontaneous stuff can happen, but like, when you're touring, there's load-in time, there's routine time. I'd imagine you're putting out a new record, there's press scheduling and all that. So like routine is almost kind of like one of those things where you need it at times, but you can't get too used to it either.
For sure. And I often wonder, like, I know a lot of bands in the 70s, for example, like wrote albums on the road, and I have no idea how they did that. I guess they must have, I don't know. I guess if you're having people doing that shit for you and you're just showing up somewhere and it's like, hey, we have 3 hours to jam before like the show starts or something. Like I could see that. But
they didn't have Game Boys back then, that's why.
Yeah, that too, but thinking of like us being on the road, I can't imagine writing anything of worth on the road, because it is so much that kind of life. It's like you get up, you drive, you get to a place, inevitably you have to like scramble to get food somewhere, you come back, you don't want to miss all the bands, like you want to catch songs of everybody, so there really isn't a lot of time.
Yeah.
And time that you do have, it's like, oh fuck, I know these people in Denver, I gotta go talk to them or something, so there's always something in the way. And then if you're lucky, you have like 20 or 30 minutes to warm up, and then the show happens.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those, I feel like really, one thing I've noticed is with the perception of time, and we went deep within this interview, so it's how I like to do it, but like I feel like when you try to process everything that happened, when you try to do that too much, you're living in the past. When you try to prepare for the future and, plan it out, you do that too much, you're thinking too far ahead. And staying in the present it feels like sometimes you're not learning from the past, or you're unprepared for what lies ahead. So
damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. That's the moral of the story. But yeah. So before we go, I want to thank you so much for your time today, for such an awesome conversation, and most of all, thank you for another amazing album. Is there just anything else with Horrendous that you'd like to promote with the release of Ontological Mysterium, or what else we could be expecting for the near future, if you're allowed to say at this moment, of course?
No, all I can really say as of yet is unlike we feel like the last record that we released, like for a number of reasons, like COVID being one of them, we just didn't get to put it out on the road as much as we wanted to, and to look out for that. Hopefully soon we'll have something more definitive to say, but we really want to give this one its fair chance, I think, on the road, and what it deserves, what we think it deserves, because it is a phenomenal record and it deserves to be heard. So we got to go out and make that happen.
Definitely will. But thank you so much, everybody. We are here with Horrendous, Ontological Mysterium. Be sure to pick that up. This is Alex from Heaven, New York, and we will see you next time.